All right. Well, Allen Buchanan is one of the most famous living political philosophers. I first met him at Duke University, where he taught for many years. He's now in semi-retirement at the University of Arizona, but still publishing a book, it seems like, just about every year or two. He served on the Presidential Commission for Medical Ethics for many years in the 90s, wrote 3 books on the topic of medical ethics or genetics and justice, which is what we're going to talk about today. So thanks for being here, Allen.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, great. So I want to start by asking a couple of general questions about just the ethics of reproductive technologies, things about inequalities, the usual kinds of questions, and then maybe talk a little bit more specifically about embryo selection using polygenic scores, which is kind of the main game in town for the next decade or two. So let's see here. The first question I had is, some people worry that technologies like in vitro fertilization, which is by now pretty old actually, that it's unnatural, maybe because it dangerously severs the link between sex and reproduction and relationships and children and so on. And I don't know, are there any good arguments for that? Is it interesting in any way? What do you think about that?
I haven't found any. I mean, I actually think that severing the link between sex and reproduction is a great thing. It's very liberating, especially for women, I think. And it's one of the things that may actually distinguish us from other animals, is that sex can play a different role, can play a number of different roles beyond reproduction. Now, this thing about what's natural and unnatural, I think there's a lot of fancy footwork going on, that people are smuggling in their moral assumptions under the label of what's natural or what's unnatural. And, John Stuart Mill has this great little essay on nature, and he says, nature can mean only, 2 things. It's either sort of everything there is, with the laws of nature of physics that determine how things work, or sometimes we think of nature as the way things are without human intervention. But in either case, there's not a problem about doing unnatural things. You can't do unnatural things in the first place unless you're God, because that would be a miracle, right? Acting contrary to the way things are. And in terms of interfering with nature, well, we do it a lot, and it's a good thing a lot of times. I mean, giving insulin to a diabetic changes the course of nature for that individual in a good way. So I conclude, as Mill did, that using the distinction between the natural and unnatural doesn't really help clarify things. It actually obfuscates and covers up controversial moral assumptions that people make. I mean, people say, sex between 2 males is unnatural. It's an unnatural act. Well, they're condemning it, and I'd rather just come out and say why they're condemning it than try to make it sound like it's a factual claim that somehow it's going contrary to nature.
Right. Yeah, there's often this mixing of a kind of empirical claim with a moral claim, and it's usually smuggled in there.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah.
So some people worry in the reproductive realm, when you have these technologies like embryo selection, eventually gene editing, that there will be unequal access to this technology at first because it'll be expensive. Now that it probably won't be as good at first, but it will be expensive. It'll have some effect, and so people worry that unequal access will just exacerbate existing inequalities, and that's unfair. So what do you think about that? And do you think, should governments or insurance companies or some entity like that ameliorate these inequalities?
Well, I think it's going to be hard to imagine in the short to medium term any kind of biotechnologies that are going to produce inequalities among humans as great as the ones we already have. I mean, if you're born in a less developed country in the poor social class, and you compare that to being born in an advanced economy country in an upper class, the latter are enhanced individuals compared to the others, okay? So, I mean, it bothers me a little bit that people don't worry as much about that inequality as they do about these speculative inequalities. But the other thing that's interesting, you said at first maybe access will be unequal. Well, for certain kinds of biomedical enhancements, let's call them, there's going to be a very short period of time when they're only affordable by the rich. I mean, if you're talking about pills that provide cognitive enhancements, for example, they're going to go off patent, and they're going to get them at Walmart for $4 for a month's supply, just like every other drug that becomes generic, presumably. And also, if some of these enhancements, especially cognitive ones, are really powerful, then the government is going to treat it, I think, like they do education. They're going to think that to compete with other countries where these things are being used, they're going to have to subsidize access to these. I'm not downplaying the problem of inequality. I think there's a serious problem, but I think people often don't look at the other side. And here's another idea. The rich people who first use these technologies are risk pioneers. We're profiting from their being guinea pigs, self-selected guinea pigs to undertake things which may or may not turn out very well, and they're going to bear the cost. We're not. So that's the silver lining. Again, I'm not minimizing the problem of inequality, but I think you have to look at particular biotechnologies, how they work. You can't make a big generalization that they're all going to be bad on balance because they're going to exacerbate inequalities terribly.
Good. I like that answer because I wasn't going to ask this, but I think it's interesting how, if artificial intelligence continues to evolve at the rate or even an accelerating rate that it is right now, maybe, having inherent cognitive advantages or something like this will be less important than having access to some of these social technologies. Or
I think that's exactly right. I think that if there's wide enough access to artificial intelligence, it can be something to level the playing ground to some extent in some areas. Now, there'll be some people who use it better than others, right? They're more intelligent at using it. But as AI becomes more user-friendly and more accessible to more people and cheaper, I think it's going to have a huge effect. I mean, for example, if you're a writer, say a historian, you used to need to hire a lot of research assistants to write certain kinds of books, and some people couldn't afford to do it. People who already made it, who already had best-selling books, could have a team of people working for them, but other people couldn't. So that was a problem of sort of access to being a successful author. But now with AI, you don't need research assistants.
Right. So if you have some minimal ability and maybe you have some intellectual virtues, you're resourceful, and you have access to some of these other social goods. Back to your point about other kinds of inequalities, maybe those are as important.
I used to have to hire a graduate student as a research assistant for $20 an hour. I don't make that much money. It was sort of hard for me to do. And now I have a couple of different AI programs that I check against each other. I also manually check sources from time to time. And it works out really well.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so I want to turn to polygenic scores, which is kind of the main technology as I see it, at least for the next decade or so. So women who do in vitro fertilization, IVF, they generate more embryos than they need, at least they hope to. If they're in their 40s, sometimes they only get maybe 2 or 3. But if you're in your 20s or 30s, you can sometimes get 20, certainly at least a dozen, even healthy embryos. And they've been testing those for Down syndrome, for single gene disorders for quite some time, hemochromatosis, Huntington's disease, and so on.
Which I have, by the way, and I'm kind of glad that my parents didn't have that technology. They might not exist if they did.
Yeah, that's right. But okay, so there's a crucial difference between single gene disorders, the typical ones that we think of, or Down syndrome, and some of these polygenic traits, whether we're talking about diseases or height or cognitive ability. And the difference is probabilities. So, we're familiar with probabilities in a lot of different realms, but the big difference here is, a polygenic risk score is going to say, like, look, this embryo is going to have an elevated risk compared to this other embryo of schizophrenia, of heart disease, and so on. And that can be a complex decision. How do you think patients, how do you think physicians, insurance companies that offer these things, how should they explain these things to ordinary people, to potential patients?
This is a really difficult problem. I think that there's good evidence that most people are not very good at probabilistic reasoning. There are lots of fallacies that people engage in. And I also think that scientists and medical people are not trained very well to communicate uncertainty. And this came out during the pandemic, I think. There were times when the head people in the Public Health Service, CDC, would make statements as if they had much more credibility than they did. And they were afraid to admit uncertainty because they thought some people say, well, you don't really know, you're just guessing, right? And to admit uncertainty is not to say you're just guessing, but most scientific results have some degree of uncertainty. And it's very hard to communicate this and to not fall either into sounding more certain than you are or making it sound like it's just subjective, you know. Yeah. And I think there has to be a lot more work on educating the public and people in particular that are using these services. There's got to be a lot of pre-selection counseling, but also I think the people who are running the services need to learn to communicate risk effectively, and it's very difficult. It's really difficult. There are problems about some people understanding probabilities if they're using polygenic testing, but these are not new problems. They're problems that are pervasive whenever you consult an expert about anything, about, you know, what repairs your car needs or what medical treatment you need. And I think one of the best things that people can do in thinking about these new technologies is to keep asking, is this aspect really new, or is this just a new instance of something we've been dealing with already? And it makes the things seem less alien and threatening, and it leads you to think, well, maybe we already have some resources for coping with these things.
I think you've talked about this in some of your books, like Better Than Human, yeah. Beyond Humanity. You know, some worry that until we know the effect of every gene on the genome, or in the genome rather, the total effect of every gene on phenotypic outcomes, on behavior, on health, and so on, we shouldn't mess around, right? Now, you probably said that in the context of gene editing. You're considering, you know, really widespread, you know, changes in the genome. But in this case, we're talking about polygenic selection. So I'm not even sure whether this objection applies. But what do you think of this objection? We should hang on, you know, just be really cautious until we know the total effects of every gene.
Well, I mean, for one thing, I don't think we're going to learn the total thing without doing some things first, right? And there's going to be some uncertainty about unintended bad consequences no matter what you do. But I think, you know, it would be too much to just say we're not going to do anything until we know everything. We're never going to know everything, for one thing. But we're going to have to operate to some extent without full knowledge in order to gain more knowledge. I think that's an important consideration. But also, you can't eliminate risk. You can only reduce it and manage risk. And the cost of managing risk tend to rise with every increment of risk reduction that you get. It's called the rising cost of risk reduction. Right? I mean, and people often tend to act in some new areas like biomedical engineering. They tend to exhibit attitudes toward risk they would never exhibit in their daily life, right? I mean, every time you get in your car, you take a risk, right? Now, you could eliminate the risk of injuries in automobiles by the following. You could have every car have the armor of an Abrams tank and have a governor that limited it to going 2 miles an hour and have an exterior that was like marshmallows, so if you hit a pedestrian, it wouldn't hurt them, okay? And you could probably almost entirely eliminate vehicular injuries and death, but it would be at too high a cost. It wouldn't be worth it, right? We make these trade-offs all the time about risk versus benefits, but in certain new areas, we act as if we never do that, and we apply completely different, over-demanding standards for this. Now, there are risk reduction heuristics, guides that rules of thumbs you can use, and I've identified some of them in some of my work. I mean, other things being equal, you want to make an intervention that's containable. If you make a mistake, it's not going to propagate in some way, right? And you want to make interventions that are reversible, if possible. There's a whole list of rules of thumb that can help guide you to managing risk, not eliminating risk.
Right. Yeah, and those rules of thumb probably apply especially well to, let's say, gene editing, assuming that becomes feasible in the future. But yeah, when we're talking about embryo selection, it's not especially dangerous anyway. We're talking about sperm and egg joining, whole natural embryos. These are things that, you know, are viable after they've been tested for Down syndrome.
You're going to be making a selection that is going to occur spontaneously in other cases anyway, right? I mean, you're not like adding new genes or something like that.
Exactly.
So you already will have some evidential base for what's likely to happen because you're not really doing something new. You're just increasing the frequency of certain kinds of patterns of genes that are occurring, quote, naturally anyway.
Right. Yeah, I remember teaching your book to some students called Better Than Human, and you make a point toward the end of that book, it might have been chapter 5, the kind of conservative, the really rational conservative case against enhancement. You know, you consider yourself a kind of bio-liberal, but, you know, bioconservatives have some interesting points. And one thing you had said is maybe there would be a reason not to select traits in favor of, at the kind of upper bounds or beyond the upper bounds of some distribution that's normal for humans.
Yeah.
What is there a good argument for that? What
I'm
are you
not
thinking
so sure about that anymore.
Okay.
I mean, I think that might have been a little too conservative. The idea was, maybe you can try to enhance cognitive ability, but don't try to enhance it above the upper limit on the quote normal distribution of it.
And that's the normal distribution for humans in general. Or something
for humans
like
in general.
Yeah.
And the idea was that at least we know what it's like. We know that there are some people at this upper end of the distribution, and we presumably know that they don't have terrible problems for the most part. Okay, so you're safer if you only go up to that point. If you go beyond that, then maybe it's a little more uncertain. Maybe it's a little more uncertain, but where the normal distribution is sort of an accident of evolutionary history anyway. And there's no reason to believe that that's the optimal high point, right? It might be higher than that. And what's the optimal high point is going to depend upon the environment, what the demands are for people handling vast amounts of information that we can now get. So I've really pretty much backed off from that one as being maybe a little bit too conservative. Now you could say, well, other things being equal, if you have a choice between two interventions and one of them stays within the upper bounds, then maybe it counts a little in its favor or something. But I wouldn't view it as something that rules out an intervention if the intervention would place you a little bit above the norm.
And I think in your book you had said it was kind of a general rule of thumb. It wasn't some kind of a priori
it's
reason
something that
we
can
had.
count in favor of something or against it, but not a necessary condition. That's the way I looked at it.
It's interesting when I was doing research for my little book, which your book inspired.
I love that book.
I was looking at data for what women seek in a sperm donor, especially lesbian women, and in the Bay Area, there's a pretty big market for sperm donors, and it was interesting because they chose a lot of the traits you would expect, which is health, and they want sort of normal height or maybe a little bit taller or something. They really cared about kindness, which was interesting. So that's
this
kind of nice.
This doesn't surprise me.
No, exactly. They want their kids to be happy and have friends.
Yeah.
But there was one interesting thing I found, and this has to be replicated, I guess, but a couple of studies showed that they do tend to select toward the upper bounds of whatever they care about. Let's say health, of course, and athleticism. They'll look for a top athlete, not just a moderate one. But they often didn't want to select the very top. So there was this kind of, again, I don't know if this is wisdom
fear
or
about the treble genius or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. So they have this kind of implicit theory, and I don't know, that might be a product of culture, or movies they've seen, or maybe there's some kind of natural aversion we all have, but it sort of perfectly mirrored what you had said in your book. So I thought that was
they might worry that somebody who was sort of head and shoulders above others on some positive trait would be viewed as different or envied, or they would feel alienated from the people beneath them. I mean, that's not totally unreasonable.
It's actually a good point. So maybe it might even be that they're not worried about any danger, any kind of like serious disease that goes with it.
About the social effects.
Just being an outlier. That's a good point.
That could be.
Yeah. So there's been some really interesting data coming out of the U.S., Singapore, other countries on polygenic screening just in the last 2 years. And one of the more interesting findings, I'm combining 2 or 3 of these, is that at least among Americans, and I take it Westerners more broadly, there is still a kind of distinction between selecting against diseases and selecting in favor of what can sometimes be described as enhancements, although it may or may not be, misleading. But people are much more in the West comfortable with minimizing disease, and there's actually a surprising amount who will cognitively enhance, or that is at least take into account cognitive ability when selecting an embryo. But by contrast to the United States, if you go to Singapore, there's no such distinction. And something like 70% say that if they were selecting between embryos, they would take, cognitive ability into account just like they would health traits. So I guess really 2 questions here, and they are pretty separate, I suppose. But one is, what do you think about this distinction between like preventing something versus enhancing? Is it real? Is it more significant? And then the second is, and I can remind you if we get off on this tangent too far, but why this difference? Why do you think historically between sort of the West and the East and how we think about this?
I'm not sure. On the distinction itself, I don't think it's a very useful tool. I think it's too much of a blunt instrument. And I think that, again, various traits are on a continuum, and to some extent, it's a social construction and a feature of our needs that we say at a certain point, this is a disease or this is a bad condition that has to be corrected for. It's not as if there's, in nature, as it were, a clear boundary that would enable you to use this distinction between prevention and treatment. And also, I just think that in some cases, you may have to enhance to prevent some diseases. I mean, suppose that, global warming keeps getting worse and worse, or suppose we get more and more respiratory infections, more and more pandemics.
New diseases, new viruses.
Yeah, you may need to enhance the capacity of the body to regulate heat in the case of global warming in order to prevent illnesses due to excessive heat. You may have to enhance the immune system in order to prevent pandemics with new emerging viruses. So, it reminds me, there's a wonderful Italian novel called The Leopard, and it's really about the predicament of a conservative in a time of revolution. And there's a great line in it where one of the characters says, if things are going to remain the same, things are going to have to change. And this, I think, is really important. In order to sustain levels of human well-being that we have now, we might have to engage in enhancements.
Okay, so I had another question, which is, are there any traits that you would not want to select for in your kids? So let's say you were in this position, you're selecting between embryos. There's, of course, disease traits. There's maybe some aesthetic traits, cognitive ability, things like that. Maybe in the future, even some personality traits like conscientiousness. Are there things you wouldn't select for, and are there things you definitely would select for?
That's a great question. I can think of one thing that I would not want people to select for, and that is authoritarian personality. There's a big psychological literature on authoritarian personality.
You've written books on this. So,
and presumably, there is some genetic basis for it. If it turned out that you could identify some complex of genes that conferred a reasonably high probability, given standard environments, that somebody would develop authoritarian personality, I don't think we need more authoritarian personalities. These are people that tend to defer to leaders in an uncritical way and give leaders latitude to use unseemly means to achieve whatever goals they think are appropriate, and who don't tolerate dissent, and who put loyalty to the leader above all else. And I view these as vices.
Right. Yeah, I asked you what you would and wouldn't select for, but do you think there are any traits that nobody should be allowed to select for? And if that's true, you can think about that. But
psychopathy.
Yeah, I've thought the same thing.
Or some severe lack of violent impulse control, or maybe authoritarian personality. Though I think people shouldn't select for authoritarian personality, but I'm not sure I want government telling people
that's
they
what
can't
I was going to ask.
That's there's always a big problem between sort of what's the right thing to do and whether you trust somebody to force other people to do the right thing, and that's
right.
That gets into a whole other set of issues, I think.
So in cases like this, maybe the threshold would have to be extremely high to show that some set of personality traits was A, highly heritable, that parents could in a way select for it, and B, it really just has bad consequences like psychopathy or sadism or something like that.
I'd like to go back just for a second to this earlier question about inequality, because I think it's a really complicated topic. There's actually some advantage for us in having people who are smarter than we are, right? It's not, people tend to think if some people are a lot smarter, they're going to exploit you and use you and stuff. But also they can provide new discoveries and new forms of knowledge that the rest of us can't provide. And we have institutions that help create people like that, or take people who have the potential for being more intelligent than average, and then developing that. I mean, science is a kind of, scientific training is like that. So we shouldn't assume, that all kinds of inequality are bad anyway. Some of them they have good effects for the rest of us. And so, again, I think it's hard to talk in generalities about whether, we ought to put the brakes on biomedical technologies because they'll exacerbate inequalities. You have to look at particular cases. You have to look at to what extent government might be interested in constraining the inequalities. It's very complicated.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I like to think of, in the case of genetic selection, this sort of thing, there are going to be some people, a lot of people, who don't want to do it. They might not do it for religious reasons. They might do it just because they want to roll the dice with their partner. That's fine. I take it with both of us.
Yeah.
And if you worry too much about inequality, then that's going to be an argument for governments to step in to force them to use a technology they might not want to.
I think there are going to be a lot of people, for one reason or another, who are not going to want to do this.
Yeah.
There are people that don't want to know the gender of their child,
Right.
through ultrasound or something. They just don't want to do that.
And they shouldn't be forced to, and if that means there will be some inequalities in whatever it is, right? It could be some health ability, maybe some community will be slightly less healthy than some other, but what's the alternative, to have governments, force them to,
I mean, what I like
select.
about the polygenic selection is that it just increases people's choices. It gives them a new domain to make free choices. And it's completely up to individuals whether they want to do it or not.
Well, thank you very much for answering the questions. It's always
Good
fun to
questions.
talk. So yeah,
Really
I
good
appreciate
questions.
it.